If you were to just get up, eat, all you need to do, be at work, study, and or do both, and then just get that, do that to a means as to only get commodities to live. Let's just say you have to keep doing that and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. This is an extract of what Marx talks about, and what Marxism talks about specifically when talking about alienation. How in a society you are alienated from aspects of society around you. More so, Marxism talks about the human element in your relations to production, society, and others surrounding your life. And that is the core concept of how the Marxist theory of alienation relates directly to what I have been talking about in the class theory video. And this is going to be a continuation of that, as this works off things the class theory developed. In the ABC of social and political knowledge, what is labor? See, on page 112, it says, sorry, 113. The bourgeois state has an important role to play in the system of capitalist exploitation. First, the state provides its protection to capitalist exploitation as such. The constitutions in effect in capitalist countries proclaim private property inviolable, while the police, the courts, prisons, and other means of coercion at its disposal, the bourgeois state suppresses all encroaches on capitalist property and maintains the capitalist order of things. Second, the bourgeois state which promotes exploitation in many ways by passing anti-labor legislations and as to limit trade union rights by pursuing wage freeze policies and by subsidizing monopolies with funds extracted from the working people through taxation. Third, the bourgeois state itself exploits wage labor, the surplus value created by the workers employed by state-owned enterprises replenishes the state budget. The regime of labor at such enterprises is similar to established in a monopoly-owned plant. In some companies, amongst them the United States, strikes at government-owned factories are prohibited. In addition to exploiting the working class in the sphere of production, the bourgeois state and the entire capitalist class, for this matter, subjects to additional exploitation through taxation. And that is an example. As a dog can you see how then the concept of alienation links directly to class theory, because the nature of class theory relates to alienation itself. This all then relates to the nature of democracy and capitalism itself. The reason why I'm saying this is because if you're watching this, you're most likely from someone who is living in a liberal democracy, which is supposedly liberal democracy, or a republic, and which has been the most dominant form in the modern time. In this book here, it talks about an interesting element to this. The instrumental nature of the bourgeoisie's attitude to democracy is testified to by the practical activities of the bourgeoisie in the countries held to be classical examples of the democratism. The bourgeoisie reconciles itself completely to the violation of democratic freedoms in the countries whose ruling cliques have shown their allies of the West can depend on. Moreover, the support of audacious dictatorial regimes go hand in hand with the hypocritical complaints that there's no democracy in the countries that have broken with capitalism. And by that, I need to do one clarification. I think something more specific to say is governments controlled by capitalism. Regardless of the point, let's continue. And so, bourgeois democracy is a class relative limited democracy today. When we speak of democracy under capitalism, we do not speak of democracy in general, but of a historical, transparent type of democracy that will pass away with capitalism. That is like a interesting side note to this. I think that's relevant. For example, I said in the one before in class theory one, and this is something I do like about this classification. Because as much as people may say this is a much more complicated methodology to talk about class,
Yeah.
it's this one is very close to reality.
Those areas the landowner class, which actually means by the landed gentry and people who become what they call landed gentry.
For example, if you were to update this into modern date, I would probably say I would probably put this and never above it. I'll put I'll put probably landlord slash land owning class, and then put multinational corporations, and above that. Do you agree with that assessment? For example, that is what I'd say is relevant to this discussion, because everything else would be a adherence to the most part to Mao's definition in 1927 in terms of today's situation with some nuances here and there. But the point is, this relates directly to the point at hand when talking about alienation, because the side effects of class theory makes the alienation stronger or worse in some cases. This then leads to the alienation theory itself. As defined here specifically, alienation is a transformation of people's own labour in power, which rules them as if by a natural or superhuman law. The origin of alienation is community fetishism, which believes that that inanimate things, commodities, have human powers, i.e., value, able to govern the activity of human beings. What that comment means is to say that commodities under a capitalist model can have more control over your choices in life. That is to say, do you go out to eat or do you cook at home? Do you go out? What sort of place do you buy or rent? What sort of thing do you get for your entertainment? Can you even afford to do X or Y? Do you get a cheap laptop, expensive laptop? Do you get a cheap TV, expensive TV? Do you get etc. 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 It all affects life quality. How commodities and how it's priced then ultimately affects all of those factors. Alienation is an idea developed by Marx in 1844, economic and political. Yeah. And as you can see, it's a very rooted thing from the very original foundations. And it comes down to this. Marx's main point was the driving force of dialectic was the man himself. When saying man himself, just humans themselves. If you say man, women, and children themselves, if you want, not just his thought, but but the whole of man. Beginning with the alienated man at the point of production, then and that whereas bourgeois ideologists, because of their place in production, have a false consciousness because they must defend the status quo and are prisoners of the fetishization of commodities. The proletariat, because of its place in production, is a negative principle driving to a resolution of contradictions. And that's where it's actually kind of a interesting dynamic around that, because I'm starting this point to say one thing here. Those to translate what this means properly into more loose language. This it means as a result that those who are people who produce, as in the factory owners or product owners, they will need to push forward in making the commodities being continued to be made and produced and pushed out, because they have no because if they got money that way, with no other way to get money, that's the only way you can do it, and that's basically how the core functionality of it. Why this is an issue is because there's no, not this one. Here we go. As said here, in a capitalist economy, work is organized around production or commodities. That is, goods and services for sale for profit and an increasing global market. As animals, we are defined by action as opposed to plants or rocks, and as humans, we depend for survival on production, similar to other animals, but also on the production of our needs, food, shelter, clothing, fuel, etc. In a way that is unlike any other animal, in that we work in a collective, creative, and planned way to transform our environment, and not simply depend on crude instinct. Again, as I covered in this point here, as I will show for 2 seconds.
Will only change once the social economic conditions change. The reality of the world around us will change our thinking. Our thoughts can't change the reality of the world around us. So whatever you think, it might make it so. The material conditions make it so, won't they? You there, man?
Oh, yes, I am. I was just getting this done. And also, to highlight this point even further, the bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to the production and consumption to every country. To the great, chain Chaklin of reactionists, it is drawn from under the feet of industry, the national ground on which it stood, and all established national industries have been destroyed, or are daily being destroyed. They are being dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes the life and death question for all civilized nations by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw materials, but raw materials drawn from remote zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home but in every corner of the globe. For history, how work is organized socially has been a profound effect on us individually and not just and in social groups. Marx noted that capitalist production, as it evolved and dominated in the past 300 or 400 years, involved the complete alienation or loss of control over the productive labor and the process of labor. Increasingly, workers did not own the means of production. The place of work, and the tools to do it were increasingly owned by an employer class, and workers had only their labor power, their potential to work and to sell on the labor market, as Marx put it. The activity of worker is not his spontaneous activity; it belongs to another. It is the loss of his self. This, the products made by the worker are not theirs to use or dispose of, and success or failure of those products is defined by buying and selling in a market rather than by the quality or usefulness. And that itself is what we're talking about here specifically. And I hope that makes things clear to the narrative as a whole. The underlining factor in this section is talking about the appreciation and depreciation of how you see work and equality around work. Specifically, if you have no pride in your work and you can't directly get pride out of what you're doing in terms of your work you're doing, you won't necessarily find any enjoyment out of the situation itself. This article also quickly continues by saying competition between bosses in a market means a consistent drive to increase production rates and reduce costs, leading to pressure to work longer hours, work harder, and for less pay. In this setting, it has become an often unacknowledged norm for workers to consider their work as something they do out of necessity to make a money to live, rather than as an enjoyable activity in its own right. And this aspect is the wage slavery aspect, in which people need to earn money to pay for other commodities and housing, which is being imposed on them by capital and capitalist institutions. And this is where the problem is with this, because you need to get financial gains to live while also trying to balance passion as well as your own mental stability while doing. Need for money and the fear of unemployment becomes the motivators rather than any desire to express ourselves through work. There's only the one worse. There's only one thing worse than having to get up for work. That is not having to get up for work. Expressing sentiment towards work of dissatisfaction and fear. Competitive. Yeah, whatever. And that's a good example of that point. Let's see. Um, which then leads to the estranged labour stuff, which leads to alienation as well, which is also defined by the class stuff, because this will determine how you deal with labour in depending on where you fit in the class system. Okay, let's go and go this. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. The more his production increases in power and size, the worker becomes ever cheaper commodity. The more commodities he creates, the devaluation of the world of man is in direct proportion to increasingly value of the world of things. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and work as a commodity. And that's something you need to understand as well. And this is that work isn't what is being produced by the workers is a commodity, that's correct. But also, as is pointed out here, which also links to everything else, the workers themselves become commodities. At this rate, at which it produces more commodities in general, which is, and a good commentary to say is just being part in the machine to make a machine sort of situation. And to continue, what's saying, let's try and find this. The worker can create nothing without nature. Without this notorious external world, it is the material in which his labour is realised, in which it is active, from which by means it is produced. But just as nature provides labour with the means of life, in the sense that labour cannot live without the objects on which it operates on the other hand, it also provides the means of life in a more sense, i.e., the means of physical subsistence and the worker himself. Thus, the more the worker by his own labour appropriates the external world, censorious nature, the more he deprives himself of the means of life in two respects. First is the censorious external world, and more ceases to be an object belonging to his labour, to be labour means of life, and second, it in that it more and more ceases to be a means of life in the intimate sense. What this means is to say, means of life, that is to say, what you need to actually physically do. So let's go over the actual wording we're talking about here, right? The wording itself is very specific to the situation surrounding it. Basically, if you have less money, less opportunity to get money, you have less means and less chance to get enough means to an end. So less physical capital or less capital in general to get what gets you what you want. Versus those who have more capital can get what they want much easier. Means for the physical substance for the worker. In both respects, therefore, the worker becomes a servant of the object. First, that he receives an object of labour, i.e., he receives work, and second, he receives the means of substance. This enables him to exist, first as a worker and second as a physical subject. The height of this subservience is that it is only as a worker that he can maintain himself as a physical subject, and not as a physical subject that he is a worker. And this is where stuff like corporate culture comes in, where they want you to bind yourself to a culture around a corporation, to have your identity around being a worker or employee of X or Y, being part of the community of X or Y, and so on. And that is why this distinction is there, because they want you to have a greater bond to your workplace so you don't leave and don't move on and contribute more to the environment around the work. The reason that I said it, because that's really important. Those who buy the products in terms of the external factors outside the workers are also the people buying into commodities and also being part of the cycle itself. But the issue is, it's not so easy to just cut off. You need a degree of privilege to just do that. Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labour by not considering the direct relationship between worker, labour, and production. It is true that labour produces for the rich wonderful things, but worker deformity. It replaces labour by machines, but it throws one section of the workers back into the barbarous types of labour, and it turns the other sector into a machine. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, stupidity, so on, so on, so on. And this is another interesting dynamic to consider when thinking about alienation. Right, which then can lead to this point here, which is about the commodity of Marx, back to Marx himself. A commodity appears at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is, in reality, a very queer thing about abounding in metaphorical subtleties and niceties. So far as its value is to use, there is nothing mysterious about it. Whether we consider it from the point of view that its properties is capable of satisfying human wants, or from the point that the properties of production of human labour. And this is one aspect of Marxism in which there is a focus on work being done out of the human happiness to do work versus work that is being done out of mandatory labour, basically. So that's where this is coming from. What is being talked about when so much capitalism is talking about the labour being forced on you out to exist. The difference between that and work you willingly choose is to give a good one example is if you volunteer or do something, as I will be doing soon in next semester of university, where I'll be doing student mentoring. That's all volunteering. That's all work you have to do that isn't paid for, but you do. I'm doing the volunteering for other reasons because I can get accreditation on my CV as well as a official certificate from the university for doing extracurricular activities on volunteering, which will actually help me in the long run. But it's more than that. My point is that is actually work you do voluntarily and that is actually beneficial for yourself and others and isn't forced on you. Clearly, it is clear as noonday that man by his industry changes the form of materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. And that can't be disputed. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet, for all that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it changes something transcendent. It no longer only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to other commodities, it stands. The point mentioned here is to say that, using the wood example, the carpenter makes the carpenter and everyone else involved in the wood production makes the thing. Let's say, for example, a carpenter then makes a table, as per the example, and doesn't sell it and keeps it for himself and gives it for family to give. That itself would be a passion where the carpenter then would be creating a passion job to give to people he cares about, not necessarily making it for commodity value. Therefore, it can have imperfections or perfections equally as much, but it won't be necessarily valued by the systems of the market. The point is, when it says transcendence here, means to say that Let's say the carpenter instead makes a table or chair or anything from wood and gives it to the market. It's given to the market to be sold in the market, and as a direct result, then it has to compete with everything else that's from other entities, and then there's another standard applied, which is the market standard, and ultimately which could be a hindrance or help depending on things. But the point is to say is that the value differentiation between the creation is different between the two models on its own head and involves outside wooden brain grotesque ideas, far one more than table turning ever was. Basically, what basically, yeah, the fetishism of commodities has its origin as the foregoing analysis and has already shown in the particular social character of labour that produces them. As a general rule, articles of utility becomes commodities only because they are produced products of labour of private individuals or groups or individuals who carry on their work independently of each other. The sum total of labour of all these private industries forms a aggregate labour of society, since the producers do not come into the social contract itself except the act of exchange. In other words, the labour of the individual asserters itself is a part of labour of society only by means of relations which the act of exchanging establishes directly between the products and indirectly between them, between the producers. What this is highlighting here is that there's the cultural difference between modern capitalist economics and the conventional economics before modern capitalist economics. And as a direct result, it's talking about the difference between stuff like the WI stuff. Okay, let's explain what WI is. WI is because I grew up in countryside UK. There was women's institutes, and what they were was when people did their own passion cooking to ultimately make things. For example, my mother made apple flans and Anzac biscuits. And how that works is basically as if you're 16 and over and can cook or produce something of value, it's like a mini market system where you are the owner of your stall as well as the producer and everything else in between. There's nothing like capitalist economics involved in it necessarily in terms of like big businesses where there's like corporations, middle management, and all that. That's probably what is being referred to here. How the cultural difference is there. It was just I think that's enough to highlight the point. And the reason why that relates to things here is that at the end of the day, there is a thing where people actually do like to do work and to produce stuff. For example, what I'm doing for example, people who actually like to work and like to care for people. That's a very thing there. But alienation can also happen because what often happens when there's a push for longer hours and basically not good pay, as for example as in the hospitality industry, then you get a unique issue attached to it. That is the issue surrounding how do the workers themselves manage things. After all, there's a thing of a let's say what's the correct term? Um, it's not 7 day week. It's like a 8-9 day week cycle, and to clarify what that means is people work under that for, as said, 7-8 days in a row with like 1 or 2 days to get over shit, then back into the cycle again. That creates a cycle of exhaustion, overworking, and wage exploitation that occur. So that, and in some cases, and in Australia's case, even if you do work very long hours, earning lots of money, it's honestly not worth it for taxes, because the taxes will make, in some cases, if money you earn isn't be coming in the right way, you lose a whole day's work in taxes alone, making the case that if you work too hard in some situations, you lose the actual incentive to do it. The final source I'll be doing today is just this one, and then I'll do my concluding thoughts, and then people can go talk in the comments about what they thought. Um, According to Marx, as we have seen, laws of political economy and the facts of economic life rests on uncriticized presumptions. Yada yada yada. You can read. I'm not going to read everything for you. But one point here that's really important is, I think this says it well enough about the points that Marx was showing. 1. The product of man's work and ultimately the outer world and sense experience of all nature are alienated from man and confront him as hostile and tendencies dominate him. Man's own activity, the process of labor itself, is alienated from him, made into an independent object, and similarly dominates man instead of being dominated by him. The alienation of nature from man means alienation of man from his own universal generic social being. His generic social existence, instead of representing his own essential nature, becomes a mere means for satisfying his narrow individual demands. His alienation of man comes from his universal being, comes also his alienation from other men. Instead of being an expression of his own universal essence, they confront him as being hostile beings. Political economy cannot escape or resolve these contradictions because it does not criticize private property, because it does not see that true basis of private property is human alienation. But in the Paris manuscripts, at least, Marx insists on the logical priority of alienation. It is not enough to merely criticize or reject private property without recognizing and resolving the human alienation that undermines it. Thus, he emphasized somewhat obscurely that instead of asking what is the origin of private property, we should ask, how can we explain the alienation that broke out in the course of human development? Instead of studying laws of economic development from the abstracted viewpoint of private property from within alienation, we should ask, what is the relationship between general nature of private property as it is developed out of alienated labour and truly human and social property? 4 years, whatever. And that's actually a very good point to be made here, and that's what I will leave you on. Because the question said here is actually quite good. What is the relationship between the general nature of private property as it has developed out of alienated labour and truly human and social property? That is something I will leave you on to lead to the final concluding thoughts section. In short, then, it's fair enough to say then, to define all of this analysis so far, I'll make this a quick 2-minute brief within 2 minutes just to end this. As I'm sure you learned already from this, it's a case in which alienation is talking about the commentary about the relationship between the social and the practical elements behind work and society itself. And in terms of the Marxist sense, it's more specifically talking about the relationship between work, the social, and everything like that, in the sense of the economic status surrounding the situation. And the point of this is to say that alienation itself can occur more and more so today because there's an increase in stresses in general. Because I noticed that even with university, how there's more stresses of like study as well as having to balance study, work, as well as family matters and so on. And that's why the university itself is giving more concessions to leniency about extensions, for example, because they understand that the burnout mode can kick in nowadays much more so than before, because the actual aforementioned points about wanting to expect more labor from things in much shorter time periods will alienate you from others and cause you greater stress. And that's what this is about. Alienation is when you're expected to be something that you are not fundamentally. And it's just talking about the sensation you get from it. The feeling of the imposter syndrome about not having the ability to necessarily be the person you want to be in all aspects. And that's where this factor comes into play majorly because, yeah, I'm sure you get the point. And if you have any confusions to this, just comment in the comment section below. Or join the Discord server where I can directly conduct with you one-on-one about it. Okay? Goodbye.